How many of y'all are kind of having a rough week already and it's only Tuesday? Okay, I kind of feel you. I have a statistics midterm immediately after this class. Y'all want to know what time I started studying for it yesterday? 11:30. We're not even going to talk about what time I went to bed last night. I don't think I did. But we're here. So happy midterm week. Yay. Thanks, Catherine. No, so, we have covered a lot of stuff in 8 weeks. And you might be feeling a little overwhelmed by it. But what I hope and if you kind of remember back to something I said on the first day of class, this course is kind of front-loaded. We cover a lot of stuff in the beginning, but what you're going to kind of notice after the second exam that y'all have next Tuesday is we're going to kind of start slowing down a little bit. And so we're going to take some more time on things. And really, a bulk of what we are going to talk about will be done by Thanksgiving. We'll come back and talk about a few more things, but you're getting a lot of the content now. And the reason for that is that the things we're going to start talking about after the second exam are really going to be based on the foundation of all these different theories we've covered. And so today, I would say is probably one of the last leadership theories we're going to talk about. Because really, a lot of the stuff we're going to cover after this exam, we're going to look at ethics. We're going to look at motivation. All of those different things that you're going to we're going to have conversations on those, and you're going to help me tie in the leadership theory that we've talked about into those things. So before we talk about our kind of last theory today, let's do a quick recap. So if we were to have kind of these different sections that we've gone through, we have power, we have trait theory, we have skill theory, we're going to just jump right over behavior theory, and then we have contingencies, right? For the most part, we could put everything we've done this semester into one of those categories, right? So what first would you say power? What's power all about? Why did we discuss power at the beginning of the semester? Welcome to class, Peyton. Everybody give them a round of applause for coming. We appreciate it. Power was all about,
Influence and getting people to do what you want.
Influence, getting people to do what you want. What you want. And it also tied into this idea of just kind of, and I'll say this, leadership definitions, right? We talked about how there's all kinds of different definitions. Our definition includes the word influence, so we had to talk about power to be able to understand what a leader's influence is. And we also had that discussion of manager versus leader, and that there's obviously many different kinds of powers there. So then trait theory. Give me some examples of the trait theories that we talked about.
Wasn't it like confidence and integrity?
Well, so we had those 5 traits. So like the 5 main traits that have been seen over a lot of the trait theory research. What were 2 very specific models that we talked about in this class?
The emotional intelligence.
Emotional intelligence. And what was the other one? There was an acronym for it.
Big 5.
The Big 5, ocean. And what we discovered when we looked at these is that traits could be seen as characteristics, right? Well, that's what these are. These were characteristics. Or they could be seen as a part of a person's personality. Okay? So then we started diving into skill theory. What's the one theory that we really focused on with skill theory? Technical, that instead of personal, human, and then conceptual. And so that's the 3 skill model, right? And it was this dude named Katz. You kind of see that sometimes. But yeah, we had technical, human, skills, and then we had conceptual. Okay? From there, we jumped into behavior. What were some of the behavior theories that we talked about? The leadership grid, yeah. Sorry that this is like going over the 2 boards. But the leadership grid. And so, again, if you kind of want to remember some names, you start to see Blake and Mouton, right? And the leadership grid introduced us to what for the first time? 4 different what? 4 styles. So this was the first time that we saw styles. Now, anything else in behavior? What's another big piece of behavior that we talked about? What dimensions are involved in leader behavior theory? Called a bunch of different things depending on the models that you look at, but what did we call it? And remember, it's one of those things that I said after we learned about it, you're going to start seeing it in absolutely everything. Task and relationship. Okay. So then, that's a lot of stuff, y'all. So we were getting ready for exam 1 at this point, and right before exam 1, we talked about a theory here that I said kind of bridged between behavior and contingency. What was that?
Situation.
Close. It was right before. The continuum. So the leadership continuum. Okay. So then we took the exam. We got into contingency theory. So we've been in contingency theories for a while now. We've talked about as many contingency theories almost as we have these other areas of leadership theory. What's the first contingency theory we discussed? Situational. And then when we decided that situational leadership kind of threw you off a little bit because it still wasn't answering all the questions, what was the next?
Path goal.
And then, what did we discuss after path goal theory?
LMX.
Ooh, before LMX.
Wasn't it the one that we had the handout for? That wasn't
The normative decision-making model.
Which one was that?
And then, after we talked about the normative decision-making model, what did we spend a whole week on? LMX. Yep. So, leader-member exchange. LMX. Now, we're not going to today talk about all the differences between these things. Yes?
Was the continuum the democratic, autocratic? Okay.
Laissez-faire, yeah. And if you remember, the reason why it bridged between those two is because those were 3 styles, so it was leader behavior. But what determined the style that they took? How much they were going to involve followers. So it was the first theory to talk about followers, but it didn't take into account context yet. So it's kind of that bridging. And then also you can see where those styles were similar to some of the leadership grid, but then styles also similar to that idea of the normative decision-making model. How much do you involve followers in decision-making? What's the relationship look like? All of that. So, again, we're not going to go into the details of the differences between all of these, but I think that's something, and Cami Grace will talk to y'all about this at the end of class today. On Thursday, when y'all get ready to review for the exam, I think that'd be a great place for y'all to start is, all right, here's everything we've covered. If you can identify what the differences are between things, you've learned the material and you're prepared for the exam. And so again, everything's been built in a way that all these theories have built on each other. And so what's missing in one is being answered in the next one, hopefully. So that brings us today to transformational leadership. And here's what I want you to know. Based on what you've read, does transformational leadership fit into any of these categories of leadership theories?
It kind of encompasses all of it.
Why do you say that?
Well, I remember reading and it was talking about how you transform, like you can be laissez-faire, and that's an effective leadership style because it's an effective leadership style if you are delegating responsibility to the followers. You can change and you can be autocratic.
Yeah. So, really, when we go through it today, you're kind of going to realize that there's a little bit of everything in it. And so to just call it a contingency theory doesn't do it justice. And what you need to know is, again, if we were to put on the top of these categories a timeline, we would be able to say, okay, remember a little over 100 years ago, we started talking about power. What is influence? Kind of included in that, we started looking at what makes leaders great. So the great man theory, that's something else you probably want to add on there, is where the great man theory ties in. But then we realize, okay, traits aren't enough. So we start studying this idea of, well, we think leadership can be learned. So what skills can we teach people so that they can be better leaders? And, well, shoot, that's not enough yet. So we need to actually see what are leaders doing and describe what leaders should do that's most effective. Well, dang it, that ain't working either. Some people went back and started looking at traits more, so there's a little bit of a turnaround. But then we come back into this idea of contingency theories that pulls in followers in the context. And so on our timeline, we're probably like in the 1980s right now. And I want y'all to think about that when we're talking about transformational leadership, because I want y'all to think about what was going on in the late 70s, early 80s that would make people say, all right, what we think about leadership, we're not quite there yet. There's still something big missing. And so I want y'all to think about what's been missing that transformational leadership answers. Okay? So my goal for today is we're going to go through these slides pretty quickly. Please ask questions as we go through them. Take some notes. If you didn't print them off, take some notes here. You don't have to take copious notes because you've got the slides online. But I need for you to take enough because then we're going to watch a TED Talk. And we're going to use that TED Talk to apply transformational leadership. Okay, so you're going to need your notes to be able to refer back to it. So, transformational leadership is this new paradigm of leadership. And the reason for it is that it's pulling in some new elements. It's kind of going back to trait theory a little bit in the idea that it realizes leaders just effective leaders seem to have some sense of charisma. And before we called charisma a trait, but the view on charisma this time is a little bit different. We're not going to emphasize it so much here, but do make sure that you read that section in this chapter. There might be a question or two about it on your exam. Some people will say that charismatic leadership is its own leadership theory. I'm not convinced of that, so that's why we don't look at it in and of itself. But know that in transformational leadership, there is this idea of that whoever the transformational leader is has a sense of charisma. Who is someone in the past 10 years that you would say has been a charismatic transformational leader? Whether you agree with them or not, they've been pretty transformational, charismatic.
Are you looking for someone to say Trump? Or?
No, because we'll get to that. Yeah. So, okay, Gage kind of mentioned Trump, so if we're going to talk about presidents. In the past 10 to 15 years, have we had a very charismatic president? Who is that president? President Obama. Again, whether you agree with his positions or not, as a whole, he's going to go down in history as a very charismatic president. And you'll kind of see why when we talk about the elements of transformational leadership. What you need to see, too, with transformational leadership and why this is considered a whole new paradigm and why it's not just considered contingency theory is because just like these other theories where we went from describing who the leader was to what they can do to what they do to then how they change or adapt, transformational leadership is now about how leaders think. Have we talked about that at all? No. This is a totally new perspective at looking at leadership. And so there are 4 styles that we're going to talk about with transformational leadership theory, but I put quotations around the word styles because we've been used to using the word styles to talk about behavior, right? When we got into behavior theory, that's when we started talking about styles of leadership, what leaders do. Each of these styles is more than just what they do. It's also how they think. And so just know that that term's kind of used loosely, but it's the best way to divvy up. And those 4 are transformational leaders. We have this idea of pseudo-transformational leaders, transactional, and then laissez-faire. So we're coming up again with this word laissez-faire. Okay? So some of this, and again, this is kind of why transformational leadership encompasses all of these things. You're going to start to see all of these elements pulled into it. So the emphasis, the goal of transformational leadership, whereas the other theories were all about describing who the leader was or describing how the leader most effectively interacted with followers or how they motivated followers, transformational leadership is all about what they're able to do to create change, to transform people. And so when you look at these things that are involved that help influence change, that help transform people, what are some new words that we have not talked about yet in this class when it comes to interactions of leaders and followers? Ethics. I want you to circle that. Ethics. Okay? Transformational leadership brings in a component of ethics and morality that we haven't even talked about yet, right? Again, think back to the first day of class. I told y'all that we are going to study leadership theory, and we're not going to be looking at good versus bad. We're not going to have those discussions yet about what's good leadership, what's bad leadership. We're just going to look at what's effective. And what's effective is being able to get people to do what you want, having an influence on them, and helping them either achieve your goal or their goals, right? Whether those goals are good, whether those goals are bad. Why in the world do y'all think in the late 70s, 80s, did we all of a sudden say, there has to be a moral component to this?
Didn't Watergate happen around that time?
Yes. Ding, 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 ding. Watergate. Right? We have these leaders all around us, and we've got to hold them to an ethical standard, right? Y'all, if you don't like history, just learn a little bit, because history repeats itself if it doesn't. What can I say on that? But it really started bringing in this idea that we've got to have a moral component, and this moral component includes ethics. It includes what we value, and what the leaders value doesn't match with what culturally we value. Okay? Long-term goals, looking at followers' motives, followers' needs, and again, kind of this idea that followers are a whole human being. They're not just our little minions. Would y'all say that kind of up to this point, we've kind of talked about followers like minions? What do I mean by that?
I guess more like it's not as reciprocal. It's not like the two-way thing. It's just like they're there and they do what we say.
Yeah. So even if with LMX we're trying to build better relationships with followers, what's our motive?
To get our stuff done.
So that they'll do what we need them to do and perform at the level we want them to perform at. Yeah. It's kind of been really a little self-serving, right? And transformational leadership kind of turns that thought on its head. So, key things I want y'all to notice here to take away is, again, what enables a transformational leader to have influence beyond the power that they have. So those 5 power bases, beyond that influence, is also their charisma. Why is charisma influential? Someone talk to me about that. If we're not talking about charisma as a trait, how is it influential? It makes people want to do something, right? Like, if I come in and I'm super excited about class, do y'all you may not be super motivated for class, but does it make things at least better? If I came in here and all I was doing was complaining and I didn't care about what I was teaching, would you care? Probably not. So charisma is really important. Transformational leadership makes a connection between motivation and morality. So again, that's another key piece there. It's not just about getting people to do what you want and having an influence on them. It's also incorporating a sense of morality. And so there's 4 I's, 4 components to transformational leadership. So again, if we wanted to call transformational leader a style, we're not so much focusing on behavior anymore. We're focusing on how leaders think. And it's these 4 I's that really define the transformational leader. First one's idealized influence. These people are strong role models. They're people that you want to look up to, and it's because they have a high standard of ethics and morals. So their influence comes because people believe that they're acting and thinking in a way that matches with the morals and values of their culture. Inspirational motivation is the next one. So beyond just having charisma and inspiring people and being influential, that inspiration itself is very motivating to the people around them. How many of y'all have ever gone to a conference and listened to a motivational speaker? Okay. How many of you come home and what that person says motivates you for a week? How many of you say it motivates you for 2 weeks? Right? How does someone have enough inspiration and influence over you that what they do inspires you and motivates you for the long term. It's a relationship, right? Do y'all see where relationship fits in here? I can go listen to a great motivational speaker. It's wonderful. I'm inspired. I come home, I'm motivated. I don't have accountability, right? But what if it's my ag teacher? Or what if it's my coach? And they motivate me. They have high expectations for me. They're checking in with me. They have a commitment to that inspired motivation. Next one's intellectual stimulation. So transformational leaders encourage creativity. They encourage innovation. Who in here has had tech change with Bill? I know there's a few of you because we were in there together in the spring, right? Does some of this kind of ring a bell a little bit with change theory, with Rogers? I would venture to say when we kind of look at change theory, we're looking at transformational leadership too as a piece of it. It's kind of cool. And then individualized consideration. So it's this idea that they are paying attention to followers. So because these transformational leaders have a relationship with followers, they can create a climate that's supportive to that person. So a climate that keeps them motivated. They can help meet their individual needs. What's a contingency theory that we talked about that's all about meeting the needs of followers? There's a few. Situational leadership and fast goal, right? It uses, so you've got to kind of, again, make some of these connections here. So there's this idea that they're not going to act the same way towards every follower because they're going to be meeting the need of each individual person. Everybody got the 4 eyes? Okay. So that's when we come to this question. If this is the first time that we're talking about ethics and morals, do we have leaders who do things that are unethical or not moral? Throw me out some examples. Huh? Hitler. Prime example. Right? Was he, if we weren't talking about morals, would we say he was a good leader? He was pretty daggum effective, unfortunately, right? So what we call this is we call this pseudo-transformational leadership. What does the word pseudo mean when we use it? False. I heard somebody say, what else? What else does it mean? Give me some words you use to describe it. False or... Huh?
Is it opposite?
Opposite. Fake. Right? My cousin Elena buys Chanel purses online from something, and like the website's literally called Pseudo Chanel. Okay, so fake. Yeah. Pseudo Chanel something. If you want it, I'll direct message her and get it. But yeah. Pseudo-transformational leadership. So what you need to know is these leaders, pseudo-transformational leaders, are going to have just as much charisma as a transformational leader. But the piece that's missing there is that morality piece. All right? And so you're going to start to notice that their leadership's a little bit self-serving. You're going to notice that they don't want their followers to really think. They want to tell them how to think. Right? Little care for others. Circle around the word manipulative. Very manipulative. So sometimes followers don't even realize that they've been manipulated because this person's so charismatic, they've convinced their followers to think the way that they think. They impress their values on other people and they ignore the common good. Y'all, we have a lot of pseudo-transformational leaders in our political system right now, in my opinion. Not just head honcho people, but just overall. Our political leaders in our government are supposed to be serving the common good, and I'm not convinced at the moment that they're doing that all the time. Something to think about. And then we have this third style. And honestly, I would say that this is the counter or the opposite to transformational leadership. So if we were to just talk about two today, we would say, okay, we have a transformational leader and then we have a transactional leader. Pseudo-transformational leader is the fake version, and then laissez-faire is kind of way over here. But transactional leadership is this idea that leaders and followers exchange with each other simply to get things done, and usually to get done whatever the leader wants. Rewards and feedback are what's used to motivate. What does that remind y'all of? Rewards and feedback. Where else have we used rewards and feedback in leadership theory?
Wouldn't it be kind of like path goals?
Kind of like path goal. Yep. Removing obstacles or giving rewards to keep people motivated. The components of this then, so if we're talking about feedback or we're talking about rewards, we call these two things contingent reward and management by exception. So a transactional leader, if they're wanting their followers to do whatever they need them to do, they're going to give them a reward based on something. That's what contingency means, right? Based on the situation, based on whatever. So you don't just get rewarded for doing a good job. You get rewarded if you do whatever. What are some examples y'all can think of where maybe you've been motivated to do something by contingent reward?
At Roadhouse, we play games every night. So if whoever sells the most margaritas with Coach John Kicker, you get like $5 on your dinner that night.
Yeah, so you're motivated to work harder and sell more because you want to be able to get $5 off your meal at the end of the night. Perfect example of contingent reward. Management by exception. This is how a transactional leader gives feedback. And what we mean by that is, and it can be this active or passive feedback, but it's usually that leaders aren't giving feedback to their followers until something happens, right? So a good example of that is going to be annual performance evaluations, right? Has anyone ever gone through a performance evaluation of any kind before? What is the most frustrating thing about them? Or what has been frustrating about it for you? How many times a year has the evaluation happened? Usually one time a year, right? And what's kind of something negative with that? If you're only getting evaluated one time a year, everything piles up. So you haven't known for an entire year that you've been doing paperwork wrong. And then you sit down with your boss and they tell you, you screwed up all this paperwork for the past year, and so you're not getting a raise. How would y'all react to that?
Not very good.
Not very good. I'd be like, dude, why didn't you tell me that 6 months ago or 9 months ago, right? It's so kind of a funny thing. I was talking with an assistant professor here. Professors have annual evaluations, even if they're tenured or not. You want to know how this works, though? So it's not for the academic year. It's for the calendar year, so January through December. So for this calendar year, at the end of December, so very beginning of January next year, professors are going to submit their review packets of the year for 2018. When do you think that they're actually going to receive or meet with their boss, whether it's the department head or an administrator? May. 5 months later. Then, so that's just the meeting to talk about their performance from 2018. But then we've got to have something on record, right? So the boss writes a letter explaining how that person's performance was and what they did well, where they can make improvements for 2019. When do you think they get that letter?
September.
First week of August of the year they're supposed to be making it. It's asinine. Makes no sense, right? But that's management by exception. If we were to compare transactional leadership and how transactional leaders think to transformational leadership and how those leaders think, would y'all say the theories up to this point that we've been talking about describe transactional or transformational leaders? For the most part, which one? What would y'all say? Transactional. A lot of the ways that we have viewed leadership up until this point has been pretty transactional. So you could say, sure, there's some pieces of these things in transformational leadership, but again, if we're talking about how leaders think now, we've mostly been thinking in a transactional paradigm. We're now moving into a transformational. Okay? And so then, don't freeze on me. So then we get to this last one, and again, we're going to breeze through this one because it's really similar to what we've talked about laissez-faire as up to this point. Transformational leadership theory does acknowledge a style called laissez-faire that's essentially this absence of leadership. The big thing that they say, and again, we're not looking at what they do now, we're looking at how leaders think. These leaders are people who are in leadership positions, but they avoid responsibility, they make it hard to make decisions, they don't give feedback, they don't really care about relationships with their followers, and they're not committed to change of any kind. So that kind of last point where it says there's no attempt to help followers grow, it's because they don't really value change at all. So transformational leadership theory kind of helps us look at, all right, the people that are in leadership positions, how do they think? And which of these 4 buckets can I put them in? Does that make sense? That's kind of the best way, for me at least, to think about transformational leadership. How leaders think and which of the buckets do I put them in? Okay. Again, don't worry about copying this down, but this was a chart that I put together to kind of help see the difference between these things. So knowing that there's components of each of them, there is some discussion of what that relationship between leader and follower looks like. And then there's results. So ultimately, leaders, we're doing things because we're wanting an outcome, right? Well, what's the outcome these different styles want? Which one's not up on here? The pseudo. Why isn't it up here? Because it's fake. So it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It's fake transformational leadership. So just kind of know that, and you'll maybe make a note of that when you print off the slides. All right. The book discusses some strategies for transforming organizations. And so transformational leadership theory came out of this idea that we've got to have leaders who are focused on motivating followers in an ethical and moral manner. And the reason for that is because they said that we've got to change our organizations. We've got to change how we function. We've got to change how we treat people. We need to really look hard at the standards that we have. And so Bennis and Nanas give some suggestions for that. Coos and Posner have the leadership challenge. Where have y'all heard about the leadership challenge before?
It was in one of Bill's classes that was like 3 nights.
Yeah, it was like that really quick, like intro to leadership, 3-night. JM, if you hung out with us, if you were in 2303, we talked about it a little bit in the very, very beginning of class about how to be a leader that transforms people. And there's those 5 things. And so the chapter talks about these in a little bit of detail. You might just go back and look at those. I'm going to skip over these questions, but when y'all go back to the slides and are studying, these are just some things that I want y'all to think about. Because just like every other theory we've talked about, there's good things about it, and there's been criticisms, right? And there are some people who say, if you subscribe to this idea that transformational leadership is the most effective, you're an elitist. It's anti-democratic. Why would people say that? Why would it be elitist and anti-democratic? How do people get into positions to have that much that are able to influence that much change, to transform society, to transform organizations? How do they get there usually? What would you argue? Or could argue? Do you think there's maybe some points of privilege that might be involved in the process that we haven't really looked at critically yet? Maybe. Okay. It's really easy for people to be a charismatic political leader when they came from a wealthy background and can pay for their campaign funds and doesn't matter how charismatic or moral there are, there's some privilege there, right? And so some would say, like, we can't talk about transformational leadership like it's this wonderful, great, best thing without acknowledging that there may be some issues with it. There's also this question of, okay, if charisma is so important to someone's ability to influence, you've just thrown a lot of people off the door as good leaders. Would y'all agree with that? So you have to wonder, can someone who maybe isn't as charismatic still be a transformational leader? Let's talk about it. Oh yeah. I thought this was funny. What's this an example of? A little bit of pseudo-transformational leadership and a little bit of transactional. So what this comic kind of points out is that we tend to throw labels on things sometimes, and we're going to call it transformational leadership. We're going to call it motivation, follower-centered. But when you really start looking at the conversation or what's going on, if we are looking again at how leaders think and the thinking that's going on behind it, it may actually be pseudo-transformational or transactional leadership. So, this video, what I'd like for y'all to do, it's right at a little over 20 minutes long. I want y'all to take some notes while you're watching it of what part of the theories y'all see in this video. So, if he talks about some things that are examples of the 4 I's of a transformational leader, write that down. If he talks about some things that are more transactional in nature, write those things down. If there's something that you have issue with, write it down. If there's something that you really like, write it down. But I want y'all to just, as you see those connections, make notes of them so that we can chat about it. I really